welcome everybody to this new episode of CCIR Student Spotlight. This is Oliver, and with me today is Nandini, who's coming from us from Newport High School. And Nandini, during her time at CCIR, worked on natural language processing through the Future Scholar program with Dr Balakrishnan from the University of Cambridge. So to begin, I just want to say, Nandini, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So Nandini, why don't you just very quickly give an introduction of yourself, say a little bit about who you are and where you come from.
So I'm Nandini. I live in Bellevue, Washington, and I'm a sophomore at Newport High School. And so natural language processing was something that was really interesting to me lately because of there's new inventions such as ChatGPT or these new AI programs that are really becoming popular. So I wanted to look at the behind the scenes of that and really try to understand it for myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so why don't we take a little step back and go back to sort of when you were initially picking out which course you were considering at CCIR. So I assume, so tell me a little bit about that process, sort of what you came to CCIR thinking that you wanted to do and how you ended up picking natural language processing as your area of specialization.
Yeah, so I came, so when I wanted to do CCIR, the main reason that it appealed to me was because you could actually create a research project and publish a paper, which I felt would be a really useful way to actually apply anything that I learned in the program. And it really set it apart for me. But another thing about the program is that there are a lot of different topics that you can choose from. And so what really convinced me to go for natural language processing was, like I mentioned earlier, I was interested in sort of what implications it would have in the future as machine learning and AI technologies are becoming more common, how we can use natural language processing with that. But also my parents are working in the fields of computer science and machine learning. So I thought it would be interesting for me also to get some knowledge in that way so that I could relate to what they were doing. And throughout the course, I've been able to talk with them about the concepts that I'm learning. So it's been really useful.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about what you ended up discovering, given that, so you said earlier that you were sort of drawn to NLP because of recent social developments and things like ChatGPT and so on. Tell me a little bit about, because as you know, this course was a much more sort of on the ground technical course. It wasn't exactly sort of a big picture social implication type course, but tell me about what you discovered sort of looking under the hood of how things actually work. How did that change your understanding of what NLP was and what AI and machine learning was?
So originally, I just had this sort of really big picture idea of machine learning as the computer sort of using existing data to make a prediction. But what this course really taught me was the behind the scenes of that. Like our professor really dived into depth. We learned really specific things. So we learned about specific types of neural networks, which I didn't know about earlier, such as word-to-vec, BERT, and also about recurrent neural networks. And then we also dove into sort of the behind the scenes of how the neurons are working exactly. So we had an entire session on how a neural network would use weights and biases to refine its predictions by actually using weights and biases, which are sort of like numerical values that originally, when you're using the neural network, they're randomly assigned, but over time you can fine tune them to make sure that your neural network is giving accurate predictions. And just learning the behind the scenes data of that really showed me not only how it works, but also how we can improve it or how we can manipulate it. And it helped me with my final research project.
And maybe that's given that you just mentioned it, it'd be a useful thing to now pivot to. So can you tell me a little bit about what your final project was?
Yeah, so my final project, the title was an evaluation of natural language processing on the Hindi language. So as we were going through the course, I noticed that a lot of the neural networks that we're using and a lot of the data sets that we were using in the course were in English. And so this got me curious because the course is called Natural Language Processing and not Natural English Processing. I was wondering how this could also apply to other languages because machine learning isn't only limited to English-speaking countries. And so as I was thinking about this, I decided I wanted to evaluate how the models that I specifically looked at could also function with a Hindi language. And I wanted to see if they were achieving the same levels of accuracy. And the reason I chose Hindi specifically was because I have some background with it, and that I'm already familiar with it, but I really think that this is an interesting subject to dive into with any language.
And tell me a little bit about what you found.
So obviously the results that I found were not as accurate with the neural networks. I focused mainly on BERT, so multilingual BERT and Roberta, but the results that I found weren't as accurate as you would find if you did analyze with English. But I was surprised that my models, even though we had to use pre-trained models in the course because the scope of the course meant that we couldn't utilize the large data sets that a lot of these models traditionally use. But I was surprised to find out that even though the models were trained predominantly on English, they were able to perform on Hindi languages. And in fact, for my Roberta model, my multilingual BERT model, I had a 68% accuracy, which was higher than I was expecting. And so I think that that was really interesting for me. And in the future, that's something I'd like to dive further into and just analyze why that's happening and see what implications that could have.
And I know this is a unbefitting question to ask a scientist, but what are your hunches about what the implications and significance of that finding is?
Well, the machine learning model wasn't specifically trained on Hindi languages, but was still able to sort of make predictions on that. So I think that it shows us the advances that we've made with machine learning, but also it can, in the future, I like to actually train it on a Hindi language data set if I do have the resources for that. And then see if it's actually able to do better and see how much we can change that. So, we can use existing models already to make new changes with this, to make new changes and turn our current inventions into new languages. And so in the future, because it can work on languages like Hindi, we can also use it on languages that are a little less known, or maybe languages, for example, there's a lot of languages that we used to use in the older days, but now they're a little bit less common. And maybe with machine learning, we can actually unlock the secrets of those.
Cool. So I want to now take, again, sort of a step back this time and talk a little bit about your experience with the course in particular. Just very quickly, the first question is, was this sort of your first experience doing something like an intensive research project?
Yeah, it was my first experience doing an intensive research project where most of the research work was happening on myself. Last summer, I did participate in a program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I also delved into some research regarding soft robotics. But the difference between these is that in that program, I was working with a team and, we were able to split up the work. And so this really bumped up the rigor of that. But I also found it a lot more freeing to be able to focus on something that I specifically was interested in, and I could make changes so much quicker. And I could also dive deeper into the things that I wanted to because I wasn't limited by working with a team. And so I think that this was definitely a rigorous program, but it did allow me a lot of benefits that I didn't have with my previous programs.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about, in particular, working with Dr. Pilvar, who's really one of our best AI and machine learning mentors, I think. But tell me a little bit about the experience of working with him and having him guide you through this space and guide you through this incredibly rigorous independent research project that you ended up working on.
Yeah, so working with Dr. Pilavar was really useful for me. He has a lot of experience, first of all, in the field, like in the research papers. I looked through what he's published, and he's had a lot of impact, such as he's made some really important data sets, such as the word and context data set. And we actually looked over that in the course. And I think it was really useful to meet with someone who is actually an expert in the field, so that if I had any questions, I was a go-to person that I could reach out to. And whereas if I was doing it independently, I would go on Google, but it's a lot harder to get a narrowed down sort of ideal of that. And also Dr. Palaver was also able to give us a lot of research tools and things that we could use to help us with our research. So he spent a couple of sessions talking about the different topics that we could choose when we're going towards try to finalizing our final projects. And then after that, he also showed us example projects by other students, which I found really helpful, just so I could know sort of what the ideal was, because I hadn't had a lot of experience actually writing a research paper before. So he definitely made it a lot more engaging, and also he made the course more interesting in general, but he also made it easier for me to actually accomplish what I wanted to accomplish.
So I want to pick up on the thing you said about Dr. Pilvar making the course more interesting for you. Can you tell me a little bit more about sort of some of the aspects of this learning experience that might have surprised you going into it, that you discovered to be more interesting than you thought, or anything in that space?
When I was going into the course, I thought that, it would be I thought that there were some things I thought I wouldn't find it as interesting as I did, because while I was interested in how a neural network actually worked, I was under the impression that it would involve a lot of math calculations, and it would sort of be more like a lecture, but Dr. Palaver actually incorporated some interesting examples. For example, he talked about the real world applications of what we were doing and showed us videos about how people were using neural networks. So that made it more engaging for me. And he also, instead of just focusing on math and the details, he talks about how we could ultimately use what we're learning in our research programs. For example, later on, when we were sort of finalizing our decisions, he had a session where he showed us specific projects that he already knew about, which were sort of related to our session. So that helped me sort of focus on things that I was interested in. And so I could explore those on my own time and utilize them in my research. It was also just really interesting to look at it. And then Dr. Belaver also, when we were in the middle of the course, he altered the lesson plans a little bit to focus on recurrent neural networks instead of what we were doing, which was word to vec, because that was something that he thought was important for us to use in our research.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, given that you were also in the Future Scholar course, I want to briefly touch on the sort of peer-to-peer aspect and also the TA aspect of the course. So this is one of the unique features of the particular program that you were in, which is that it really has quite a lot of structure and scaffolding built into it, with the TA support and with the sort of peer-to-peer learning as well. Tell me a little bit about working with a TA and also with sort of other students who were also exploring the space together with you.
Yeah, so I think working with the TA was really useful for me personally, because it was after our first lecture with Dr. Pilar. So he would introduce the topics and explain them. And then any questions that I had about the homework or the stuff we learned, then I could go ahead and ask the TA. And it meant that I could clarify any misunderstandings that I had really quickly. And so that was really useful, but the TA was also able to offer more personalized guidance regarding our projects, because while Dr. Palaver had to sort of focus on actually teaching us what was going on, the TA would go over with, for example, one session, he actually coded a neural network with us and walked us through each step of the process. So he allowed us to slow down the course and sort of focus on the things that we were unclear on, which was really useful because we could keep learning at the same rigorous pace, but we could also take a step back if needed. And then working with my peers was also pretty interesting. I think that was one of the parts of the program. That was one of the reasons I chose the Future Scholars program specifically, was because working with the peers meant, first of all, we could share ideas off each other. Like a couple of times in the session, we did do group we did presentations where we would have each prepared an individual PowerPoint on a specific topic that we had learned. But after I presented my PowerPoint, I was able to elaborate on my knowledge by listening to another PowerPoint or another person's perspective, which was really useful. And just hearing about everyone's projects at the end of the course was also pretty interesting.
Wonderful. So I'm also a little bit curious, given that both your parents are working in computer science. Can you tell me a little bit about what that experience has been like? I know you touched on it just earlier about how you guys were able to now suddenly talk about their work and so on. I'm just curious in this aspect, how has that been in terms of like understanding now what your parents have been doing?
Yeah, so before my parents would give me sort of high level explanations, which of machine learning, but another thing was that before the course, I sort of didn't pay a lot of attention to what they were saying because I didn't have the background knowledge to that. And so I sort of forgot it and dismissed it once they told me to sort of explain the context of their work. But taking this course has sort of created a background knowledge for me. So whenever they explain something, like my dad was explaining how he is implementing a feature at his company to actually sort something based on natural language processing into a couple of categories to improve their customer experience. I could actually understand the process behind that, and I could understand what he was doing because we actually did vote cover classification and all of that in the session. So it really allowed me to connect with that grader, and also now it sort of made me more aware of the possible fields in computer science. So if I do decide to go into that, I think it will give me a lot of help there.
Yeah, and definitely part of the goal of this program, it isn't to figure out what your future plans are, that we don't have any crazy ambitions like that, but definitely to give you a sense of what the possibilities are in some space that you might be interested in is definitely sort of one of the key objectives of this course from our end. So with that, I think we can begin sort of wrapping up. I'll ask you the question that I usually ask students as a way to sort of wrap up these interviews. And it's a very straightforward question, and it's just research can be something that's quite daunting and quite difficult, especially for someone who's never done it before. Now that you've come through the other end, what would you say to a student who might be considering doing research, but is a little bit scared or a little bit unsure whether doing research will be a useful and valuable experience for them?
So I would definitely recommend doing a research project, even if you're a little bit hesitant about it. If you can find a topic that you're interested in, that you're actually interested in, and maybe you have a little bit of background knowledge in as well, then it becomes even better doing the research because you can uncover new things that you weren't aware of before. And you can really expand your knowledge. And then even if ultimately you end up not liking the topic that you're doing the research in, or for some reason you're not too fond of your research project, you'd still gain a valuable experience. And if you ever decide to do research again, now you have something to go off. And maybe even if maybe you can publish your research paper now and you can go into a different direction. And now you know that that's not something that's for you, but you've learned the tools of how you can find sources that you'd like to use in your research paper, or how you can reach out to people to actually get your paper published. So I definitely recommend doing it. And I think one thing you should keep in mind is that it's not bad to ask for help with your research paper. Working with Dr. Pilavar really helped me understand neural networks better. And so even if you don't have a resource like CCIR, I recommend doing a Google search or reaching out to a teacher or professor that you know to really understand how the process better. So.
Wonderful. That's an excellent answer, Nandini. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for taking your time to join us on this Student Spotlight. And yeah, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.